He opened the door on a frosty night
never thought I'd
expecting to
find you
find
here.
death and found the beginning of his
And I'm so
life.
glad you did.
Have you ever stopped to think what you would do if, on the coldest night of the year, someone you had never seen before knocked on your door begging for shelter? And what if that person carried in their eyes the exact same fear you had spent years trying to hide inside yourself? What would you do? Close the door to protect the little you had left, or open it, even without knowing that this simple gesture would change you both forever? But this story took place in the winter of 1919, in the freezing high country of the Appalachian Mountains, among the ancient hemlocks that looked like they had watched the world be born, in a time when the wind howled down through the branches like lost souls, and when a lone man could go months without hearing his own voice. If you're enjoying the start of this story, do me a favor before we keep going. Drop a comment below telling me what city you're watching from. I love knowing how far these old stories can travel, and it makes me incredibly happy to see folks from all over the country gathering here to listen to another one. While you're at it, smash that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell, because true love stories, the kind from the old days, that's what we do here every single day. Now grab your coffee, settle into your chair, and come with me up into that freezing mountain ridge, because this is, without a doubt, one of the most beautiful love stories I've ever had the pleasure of telling. His name was Bernard Hayes, and it had been 7 years since he'd gone down the mountain to sleep even a single night under a roof that wasn't his own. His cabin was small, built from pine boards he had cut and fitted one by one, with a cedar shake roof that groaned when the wind picked up, and a stone chimney that breathed a thin trail of smoke all year round. It sat at the edge of a high clearing, surrounded on all sides by the dark timberline, and to reach it you had to climb a steep, winding trail through rocks and tree trunks. A trail almost no one knew about, and even fewer had the courage to climb. Bernard was a big man, with broad shoulders and hands thoroughly calloused from gripping an axe handle. He had a thick, dark beard, with a few white hairs already showing near his chin, though he wasn't a day over 40. His eyes were a deep brown, almost the color of hemlock bark, and there was a quietness in them that, at first glance, anyone would mistake for hardness. But if you looked closely, if you had the patience to truly look, you'd realize it wasn't hardness at all. It was sorrow, an old sorrow, the kind a man learns to carry in silence because he's long since given up, hoping someone might help him shoulder the weight. Every day was the same for him, and that was how he liked it, or at least that was what he told himself. He woke up before the sun, when the mountain was still drenched in that deep blue that comes just before dawn, lit the fire, heated the water, and drank his coffee black and bitter from a chipped enamel mug. Then he'd grab his axe, throw his heavy wool coat over his shoulders, and head out to work. He chopped firewood, felled marked pines, split the wood into logs, and stacked it all with an almost stubborn meticulousness. Once a month he hitched his old mule to the wagon and headed down to the village of Windy Hollow to sell his wood and buy the few things he needed: salt, flour, matches, kerosene, a slab of bacon. He exchanged the necessary words, not a syllable more, and made his way back up before the sun set. And that was it. Year after year, that was his whole life. The village gossiped, of course. Up in the mountains, where houses are few and distances are vast, everybody eventually knows everybody else's business, and Bernard Hayes's life, precisely because it was so fiercely guarded, provided more grist for the rumor mill than anyone else's. Folks said he had gone crazy after a tragedy. They said he talked to the dead. They said he was dangerous, that he was gentle, that he was a saint, that he was cursed. Everyone said whatever their own imagination cooked up. And since no one had the courage to march up that trail to find out the truth stayed right there, locked away with him, high on the mountain, among the pines. The truth, as it happens, was much simpler and far more painful than any tall tale the village could invent. Bernard hadn't always been a solitary man. There was a time, and not all that long ago, when he laughed loud, when he came down the mountain singing, when that cabin in the clearing was full of life. There was a time when there was Teresa. Teresa was the daughter of the Windy Hollow sawmill owner, a girl with an easy laugh and honey blonde hair she kept pinned in a loose bun that was always coming undone. Bernard had met her when he was just a young man hauling logs at her father's mill. It was one of those romances built on stolen glances over stacks of timber, hidden notes tucked into apron pockets, and soft conversations in the late afternoon when the mill whistle had finally gone quiet. They married in the spring, against the wishes of the old man, who wanted better for his daughter than a lowly log hauler. And they went up the mountain together to carve out a life in that high clearing, away from everyone, just the two of them. As if the whole world could fit inside that little pine cabin, and for 6 years it did. Bernard chopped wood, Teresa tended the garden and the chickens, and at night they would sit on the porch to watch the fog roll up from the valley, her leaning on his shoulder, his chin resting on her head, both of them quiet, because when love is that big, you don't need words all the time. It was the happiest season of his life, and he knew it even then, because every time he looked at her, he felt a strange sort of fear, a foolish fear, the fear of a man who has far too much to lose. The winter of 1912 was the most brutal the old-timers could remember. The frost killed the gardens, ice sealed the trails, and a fever began creeping from house to house across the mountain. A fever that started with a cough and ended, more often than not, with the preacher coming up to give the last rites. Teresa fell ill on a Thursday. By Friday, she was burning up, and Bernard, terrified, braved a howling blizzard to fetch the doctor down in the village. It took him hours to navigate the ice-choked trail. He fell 3 times, nearly lost himself in the whiteout. When he finally arrived, the doctor refused to go up. He said the mountain was impassable, that it was suicide, that he'd freeze to death on the way. Bernard begged. He offered everything he owned. The doctor wouldn't budge. He sent Bernard back with a bottle of medicine, a few instructions, and told him, not with malice, but with the exhausted coldness of a man who had seen too much death that winter, that it was probably already too late. Bernard climbed back up the mountain, clutching that glass bottle like he was carrying his own soul. The ascent, which took 2 hours in daylight, took twice as long that night. And when he finally shoved the cabin door open, his hands purple from the cold, and the bottle still intact in his pocket, Teresa was already gone, alone, in the dark, while he was down in the valley begging a man who wouldn't help. That was what broke Bernard Hayes. It wasn't just the death, because death, as cruel as it is something a person eventually learns to accept. What broke him was the guilt, that thought that drove itself into him like a rusty nail and never came out, the thought that if he hadn't gone down, if he had just stayed there holding her hand, at least she wouldn't have died alone. He traded her final moments of comfort for the false hope of a cure and lost both. From that night on, deep down, he convinced himself he no longer deserved anyone's company. He decided it was safer for everyone, especially others, if he just stayed up there alone, high on the ridge, where he could never fail anyone else ever again. He buried Teresa in the clearing, beneath a young white pine he had planted on their wedding day. He built a wooden cross, a good, sturdy one, and every Sunday morning he would go out there, stand with his hat in his hands, not really praying, because he was pretty much on bad terms with God, but unable to walk away without stopping by. It was the only commitment he still kept with the world of the living, that silent visit to the wife he hadn't known how to save. And so, between the axe, the firewood, the old mule, and the cross beneath the pine, 7 winters slipped away. Bernard hardened on the outside and went numb on the inside. The folks in the village stopped expecting him to ever act like a normal man again. He had stopped expecting it himself. Until the winter of 1919 came, and with it, on a night he would never forget, came the knock at his door. It was early December, and the mountain had been caught in a vicious cold front for a week. During the day, the sky hung in a heavy, low grey that seemed to scrape the tops of the trees, and at night the temperature plummeted so fast that any water left outside turned to solid ice by dawn. On that specific night, a Friday, the wind had shifted north, bringing a biting, freezing sleet that coated branches, rocks, and the cabin roof in a thin, glistening armor of ice. It was the kind of night where no animal with a lick of sense stuck its nose out of its den, the kind of night where the whole mountain seemed to be holding its breath. Bernard had eaten a thin supper of bean and bacon soup and was sitting near the wood stove, mending an axe handle by the yellow glow of the oil lamp. Outside, the wind whistled through the cracks and made the roof joints pop. He was used to all those sounds. He knew every creak of that house like the back of his hand. That's why, when he heard the first thud, he knew instantly it wasn't the wind. It was different. It was dull, rhythmic, human. Someone was knocking on his door. He froze, axe handle in hand, his heart suddenly hammering against his ribs. Nobody came up the mountain in broad daylight, let alone on a night like this. He thought his mind was playing tricks on him, that it was a fallen branch, a wild animal. But the knock came again, weaker this time, almost entirely spent, as if whoever was out there had nothing left to give. And then, beneath the howling of the wind, he heard a voice. A woman's voice, trembling, barely a whisper, begging, for the love of God, to open the door. Bernard hesitated, and you have to understand that split second of hesitation to understand the man he had become. It wasn't a lack of compassion. It was fear. For 7 years, he had kept that door locked, not just against the winter, but against the whole world, against the very possibility of letting someone else into his life, only to watch them leave. Opening that door meant, in a way, opening everything back up. And for 1 second, a second he would be ashamed of for the rest of his life, he thought about not answering. He thought about pretending he hadn't heard a thing, letting the wind carry that voice far away. But then the voice came again, fainter still, and this time she didn't ask for anything. It was just a moan, the sound of someone reaching the absolute end of their rope. And something inside Bernard, something he thought had died and been buried right alongside Teresa, woke up. He dropped the axe, crossed the room in 3 massive strides, and threw the door wide open. The cold hit him first, a blade of icy wind that made the lamp flame dance and nearly die. And there, collapsed on her knees on the threshold, soaked in freezing rain, her dark hair plastered to her face and her lips bruised purple, was a woman. She looked up at him, 2 huge dark eyes in a face pale as snow, and tried to say something, but her body simply gave out. She pitched forward, and Bernard barely had time to drop down and catch her before her head hit the wooden floorboards. She was freezing. Cold in a way that terrified Bernard, because he knew that exact chill. He had felt it in Teresa's hands. Without a second thought, he scooped her up. She weighed practically nothing, so light it made his chest ache. He carried her inside, kicked the door shut against the gale, and laid her on the rug right next to the wood stove, the warmest spot in the cabin. He grabbed his own wool blanket, the thickest one he owned, and tucked it right up to her chin. Then he threw more wood into the fire, feeding it until the flames leapt high and a warm orange glow flooded the room. The woman shivered uncontrollably, her teeth chattering, murmuring broken words he couldn't piece together. Bernard heated some water, soaked a rag, and began to wipe the mud and ice from her face with a gentleness his massive, rough hands seemed to have forgotten they possessed. Slowly, a little colour returned to her cheeks. The shivering eased. And somewhere in the early hours of the morning, her breathing grew deep and steady, and he realized she had finally fallen asleep, overcome by exhaustion, and wrapped in the warmth of the fire. Bernard didn't sleep. He spent the entire night sitting on a small stool beside her, feeding the stove, watching this stranger breathe, a hurricane of thoughts spinning in his head. Who was she? Where did she come from? What was a woman doing alone on the mountain on a night like this, climbing a trail that grown men were too scared to navigate? He had no answers. He only had that sleeping face in front of him and a strange, deeply uncomfortable feeling that his life, that perfectly carefully constructed emptiness he had built, had just been invaded by something he no longer knew how to handle. When the first pale light of morning started bleeding through the window shutters, the woman stirred. She opened her eyes slowly, staring at the cedar ceiling for a moment, trying to figure out where she was. Then she turned her head and saw Bernard sitting there, this giant of a man with a dark beard, watching her in silence, and her whole body tensed in sheer panic. She shrank back against the wall, pulling the blanket tight around her neck, her eyes wide with terror. Bernard raised both hands in a slow, deliberate gesture, showing they were empty, and spoke to another human being, someone other than his mule or the grave outside, for the first time in years. His voice was raspy from disuse. He told her she didn't need to be afraid, that she was safe, that she had passed out on his porch the night before, and that he had only done what any decent Christian would do. He asked how she was feeling. The woman didn't answer right away. She just stayed there, measuring him with those dark eyes, trying to decide if she could trust him. And then, in a voice that was frail but surprisingly steady, she thanked him. She said she owed him her life, and she added, almost in a whisper, that she was sorry for showing up like that, but she had nowhere else to run. Bernard asked her name. There was a long pause. One of those silences where you can feel the other person weighing exactly how much truth they can afford to give away. Finally, she said her name was Eleanor. Just Eleanor. No last name. He caught the omission, but didn't press her. He himself had spent 7 years refusing to explain his life to anyone. He knew how to recognize the heavy burden of a secret someone wasn't quite ready to share. He stood up, poured a mug of hot coffee, grabbed a piece of hard bread, and handed it to her without another word. Eleanor took it, her hands still shaking, and as she ate, her eyes wandered around the cabin. The pine walls, the neatly hung tools, the stacked firewood, the absolute absence of anything that hinted at another soul living there. No pictures of a woman, no decorations, no dresses hanging on a hook. Just the undeniable footprint of a man living entirely alone. And from his corner, Bernard noticed her taking it all in. For some reason, it made him feel exposed, as if she could read the crushing weight of his loneliness just by looking at the bare walls. His plan, if you could call it a plan, was straightforward. As soon as the winter storm broke and she got her strength back, he would take her down to the village, and they would go their separate ways. He didn't want company. He didn't want anyone else's baggage in his house. He already had far too much of his own, but the storm didn't break. In fact, that afternoon, the north wind howled even fiercer, the freezing rain turned into a blinding wall of white, and the trail, which was already treacherous, became a death trap. Taking a weak woman down through that ice would be sending them both to an early grave. And Bernard, who already carried the guilt of a badly timed descent on a freezing night, was the last man on earth to risk making that mistake twice. So Eleanor stayed, for a day, then 2, then a whole week, while the mountain remained under siege by the winter. Those first few days were filled with a strange silence, steeped in both kindness and wariness. Bernard gave up his spot near the stove and his best blanket to her, sleeping in a hammock strung up in the corner by the drafty door, like a watchman. In the morning, he'd head out early to work and return by midday, and every time he came back, the cabin felt a little different. The floor was swept, the tin mugs washed and set out to dry, the cast-iron pot scrubbed until it shined. Eleanor was not the kind of woman to sit idle, even weak, even scared. She couldn't stand the thought of eating a man's bread without earning her keep somehow. She naturally took over the little chores of the house, and bit by bit she began filling those rooms with a spark of life they hadn't seen in 7 years. At first, Bernard was almost irritated by it. Every object slightly out of place, every minor shift in his rigid routine threw him off. But it was impossible to stay mad for long, because the truth he wouldn't even admit to himself, was that the house felt warmer. And it wasn't just the fire. It was the smell of a real, hearty meal bubbling in the pot. It was the sound of another person breathing in the quiet. It was the oil lamp casting 2 shadows on the wall at the end of the day instead of one. It was all the things he had ruthlessly trained his heart not to miss, suddenly back in his life without asking permission. Gradually, the words started coming. First, the necessary ones, about the food, the cold, the chores. Then, deeper ones. One night, while the wind shrieked outside and they were sitting by the stove, Eleanor asked gently who had lived there before. She asked because she had found, tucked in the back of a drawer, a woman's tortoiseshell comb, with a few strands of honey-blonde hair still woven in the teeth. Bernard stayed silent for a long time, staring into the flames, and Eleanor was already regretting asking when he finally spoke. He told her, his voice low and his eyes fixed on the fire, that he had been married, that her name was Teresa, that she died of a fever in a winter much like this one, and that she was buried right outside, under the big white pine. He didn't tell her the rest. He didn't talk about the guilt, the desperate run down the mountain, the medicine that arrived too late. But he didn't have to. Eleanor, who intimately understood the weight of guilt, heard everything he left unsaid, in the broken way he shared what little he did. She didn't offer cheap comfort. She didn't say he had to move on, that life goes on. None of those empty platitudes people throw out when they really just want someone else's pain to stop making them uncomfortable. She simply said very softly that she was sorry, and that Teresa must have been an incredibly lucky woman to have been loved so fiercely. And then she sat in silence with him, both of them watching the same fire, and that shared, understanding silence did more for Bernard Hayes than 7 years of suffering alone. Over time, Bernard also started piecing together Eleanor's story, even without asking questions. He noticed her hands were soft, the hands of someone who had never done hard labor, yet she learned fast and never once complained about a blister or chilblains. He noticed she spoke a very refined English, using proper words, the mark of a highly educated upbringing. He noticed that whenever a horse whinnied down in the valley, she went pale, her whole body went rigid, and she'd creep to the window to peek out, waiting until she was absolutely sure no one was coming up the trail. Most of all, he noticed the fear, a very specific kind of fear. It wasn't fear of him or the cold or the wild mountain, it was fear of a person, someone she had left behind in the world she was running from. But Bernard didn't pry. Not out of a lack of interest, but out of respect. He knew better than anyone how much it hurts when someone pokes at a wound you aren't strong enough to show yet. So he waited. He let her stay. He let time, the fire, and the quiet do their healing work. And meanwhile, without either of them really noticing, something began to take root in that cabin. Slowly, like a mountain pine sapling, the kind that takes years to grow into a real tree, but once its roots lock into the earth, no storm in the world can tear it down. The blizzard finally broke on the 7th day. The north wind vanished just as suddenly as it had arrived. The sky cracked open into a crisp, freezing blue, and the morning sun made the whole mountain sparkle like someone had dusted the pines with sugar. The ice began to melt and drip from the canopy, and the world, which had been muffled under the snow, found its voice again. The song of a mountain chickadee, the rush of thawing water, the sharp crack of timber warming in the sun. It was the day when, according to Bernard's original plan, he was supposed to hitch the mule and take Eleanor back to the village. But when the moment arrived, neither of them brought it up. Bernard stepped outside, looked down the now passable trail, walked back in and said nothing. Eleanor watched him from the doorway, understood exactly what he had gone out to check, and also said nothing. And in that unspoken silence, in that quiet agreement to delay the goodbye, they both admitted for the first time, without a single word, that maybe they didn't want this to end just yet. Bernard just muttered, awkwardly staring at his boots, that the trail was still mighty slick with the thaw, and it'd be best to wait a few more days to head down safely. It was a lie, and they both knew it. But it was a good lie, the kind you tell not to fool the other person, but to give yourself permission to feel something you're still terrified of feeling. The days that followed felt entirely different. Relieved of the crushing weight of the brutal winter, Bernard and Eleanor began, without ever discussing it, to build a routine meant for two. In the mornings, she started walking him to the edge of the clearing, handing him a mug of coffee to drink before he swung his axe. She learned how to chop kindling, clumsy at first, nearly dropping the hatchet on her own foot, until Bernard, chuckling softly in a way that startled even him, stepped up behind her. Gently guiding her hands over the wooden handle, he taught her the proper swing. It was the first time they had touched without it being a matter of survival, and they both felt the jolt of it, though neither said a word. Her face flushed hot despite the winter air, and he went back to work much quieter than usual, wrestling with a feeling he hadn't known in 7 years, wondering if he even had the right to feel it. In the afternoons, when the chores slowed down, they talked. And through those talks, Bernard slowly uncovered who this woman was. Eleanor had grown up in Richmond, Virginia, the only child of a wildly successful tobacco merchant. She had been sent to a strict boarding school, learned French, played the piano, studied embroidery, everything required to mold a wealthy girl into a highly desirable bride. But Eleanor, as she told it with a bitter half-smile, had been born with the wrong spirit for the right life they had planned for her. She liked to read, to debate, to have her own opinions, and those were not traits high society valued in a fiancé back then. Her father, always the businessman, had arranged her marriage to Silas Montgomery, a ruthless timber baron. Silas was a widower, 20 years her senior, owned half the mills in the state, and possessed a temper the entire city feared. But no one dared cross him, because crossing Silas meant crossing the money that ran the region. Eleanor confessed she had tried to be obedient. She had almost made it to the altar. But on the eve of the wedding, she accidentally overheard a conversation between Silas and her father. They were negotiating land deeds, and her name was tossed around in the middle of it. Just another asset, a piece of property being transferred to seal the deal. She said that in that moment, something deep inside her simply snapped. Not out of spite, she explained, but out of pure survival. Because she knew that if she married that man, she would die a little bit every single day until there was nothing left of the woman she was. So, in the dead of night before the wedding, she packed whatever she could carry, bought a train ticket under a false name, hitched a ride with a teamster heading west, and fled deep into the Appalachian Mountains. She had no real destination, only a desperate need to put as much earth as possible between her and that fate. She wandered for days, got lost, and that was how, on the coldest night of the year, utterly exhausted and freezing to death, she spotted a thin ribbon of smoke rising from a chimney and dragged herself up that trail, not knowing who was on the other side of the door, knowing only that it was either that cabin or the grave. Bernard listened to her story in silence. When she finished, he sat thinking for a long moment. Then he told her, with that blunt, rugged honesty that was his trademark, that she had done the right thing, that running away wasn't cowardice when staying meant ceasing to exist. Eleanor looked at him, tears welling in her eyes, because it was the very first time anyone had ever validated her choice. Everyone back home had called her crazy, ungrateful, foolish for throwing away the lavish life her father had secured for her. And here, high on a freezing ridge, a rough-hewn lumberjack who barely knew her was the first person to tell her she had been right. It was in that exact moment, she would confess years later, that she began to fall in love with Bernard Hayes. Even though it would take her quite a while to admit it to herself, days bled into weeks, and winter slowly loosened its grip on the mountains. Where there had only been ice, the first stubborn signs of life began to push through. A timid bud on a bare branch, fresh green shoots breaking the frost by the creek, the ripe chestnuts falling from the trees and rolling across the forest floor. Eleanor learned to roast chestnuts over the coals, discovering she loved the smell, the effort of cracking the shells, the sweet, earthy taste. Bernard watched her make these little discoveries with a kind of quiet awe, like a man rediscovering the world through someone else's eyes. Things he had treated as mere background scenery, he suddenly saw as beautiful, simply because she found them beautiful. And then there were the small moments, the quiet, uncelebrated seconds that began to stitch them together. Her hand accidentally brushing his when passing a coffee mug, and neither pulling away quite as fast as they could have. A glance held just a fraction of a second longer than necessary when one thought the other wasn't looking. The time Bernard, walking back from the woodpile, found Eleanor softly humming a tune while mending one of his work shirts, and froze in the doorway just to listen, terrified that moving would break the spell. The time she spotted a wicked splinter in his battered hand and took his massive paw between her two soft ones to dig it out with a needle. They stayed like that much longer than the splinter required, feeling the warmth of each other's skin, neither quite brave enough to look up and meet the other's gaze. It was a nameless courtship, a dance between two people who had forgotten, or maybe never truly knew, how to love. There were no grand declarations, no poetic speeches, no bold romantic gestures. There was only the slow, timid waltz of two bruised hearts cautiously stepping closer, testing the ice to see if it would hold, retreating at the slightest scare, then stepping forward again when the fear passed. And it was exactly that slowness, that extreme care, that made it so profoundly beautiful. There was no rush up on that mountain, and love that takes its time is the kind of love built to last. It was around this time that something happened that permanently changed how they saw each other. On an overcast morning, the kind where the cold is so sharp, even the birds refuse to sing, Bernard was felling a massive pine on the slope behind the clearing. It was a job he had done blindfolded for 20 years, but the mountain always reminds those who live on it that a single second of carelessness carries a heavy price. As the massive trunk fell, it clipped a dead widowmaker branch from a neighboring tree. The heavy timber, thick as a man's thigh, whipped through the air and slammed squarely into Bernard's leg before he could dive out of the way. There was a sickening crack, a dull thud, and the lumberjack, the titan of a man who hoisted logs on his back without breaking a sweat, collapsed onto the frozen dirt, letting out a cry of agony that echoed through the entire hollow. Eleanor was in the vegetable patch when she heard it. She dropped her basket and sprinted up the slope, her heart in her throat, slipping on the damp earth. She found Bernard writhing on the ground, pale as a ghost, his right leg twisted at an unnatural angle, blood seeping through his heavy work boot from a nasty gash. For one terrifying second she froze. This was too big. She knew nothing about medicine. She was completely isolated on a mountain with a man twice her size who couldn't walk. But it was only a second. Instantly, that same fierce, unbreakable core ignited inside her, the exact same fire that made her flee a ruined life in the dead of night. She knew with absolute clarity that this time he needed her, and she was not going to fail him. She tore the hem of her skirt and tied a brutal tourniquet above the gash to stop the bleeding, just like she had read in a book once. She talked to Bernard the whole time, projecting a steady calm she didn't know she possessed, telling him it was going to be all right, that he needed to breathe and trust her. Between gritted teeth, he stubbornly tried to argue that he could just hop down on a sturdy branch, proud and hard-headed even in agony. She shut him down immediately. She hacked off a thick bough to serve as a crutch, hauled his massive arm over her slender shoulders, and together they began the grueling descent. Step by agonizing step, she nearly buckled under his dead weight, while he swallowed a scream with every lurch, but they kept moving. Together, because there was no other choice. It took them an hour to conquer a slope he usually scaled in 10 minutes. When they finally staggered into the cabin, Eleanor was drenched in cold sweat, her shoulders screaming in pain, but she didn't stop. She laid Bernard on the bed, sliced his leather boot open with a hunting knife, cleaned the ragged wound with boiled water and the last of his cheap moonshine, and bandaged his shin tightly. The leg was dangerously swollen, and she suspected, correctly, that the bone was fractured. Going down the mountain for a doctor that late in the day was impossible. So she did the only thing she could. She fashioned a splint out of 2 straight pine slats and lashed them tightly with rags, securing the break exactly as Granny Ida would later confirm was the perfect thing to do. Bernard burned with a raging fever for 2 days, and it was during those 2 days that the final stubborn wall between them crumbled to dust, because no disguise can survive a fever. Delirious, half asleep, he cried out for his long-dead mother. He cried out for Teresa. And he cried out for Eleanor, gripping her hand in the dark, like a drowning man grabbing a lifeline in a raging sea. And Eleanor didn't let go. She stayed awake for 48 hours straight, swapping cold rags on his forehead, spoon-feeding him water, drop by drop, softly singing the old lullabies she remembered from her own childhood. She tended to this giant, broken man with a fierce tenderness that shocked even her. It was right there, seeing him completely vulnerable for the first time, that she realized, without a shadow of a doubt, that she loved him. She didn't love him, despite his rough strength. But because she had seen that beneath all that muscle and grit was a man who bled, who got scared, and who desperately needed to be held. On the 3rd day, the fever broke. Bernard opened his eyes mid-afternoon and found Eleanor slumped in a chair beside the bed, dead asleep, completely exhausted, her hand still resting over his. He lay there for a long time, just watching her, and he felt something swell so massively in his chest it physically hurt. For 7 years, he had convinced himself his ultimate punishment for failing Teresa was to live and die utterly alone, unworthy of anyone's care. And here was this woman. A woman who had single-handedly dragged him down a mountainside on a broken leg. A woman who had stayed awake for 2 days straight to fight for him. A woman who had, ultimately, done for him exactly what he had failed to do for his late wife. She hadn't let him face the dark alone, and in that quiet revelation, he finally understood that maybe life hadn't spared him just to punish him, but to offer him, incredibly late and in the most unexpected way, a second chance. When Eleanor woke up and saw him lucid and staring back at her, her eyes immediately filled with tears of relief. She started to jump up to fetch water, to check his forehead, to do something useful like she always did. But Bernard squeezed her hand and wouldn't let go. He told her, his voice rough but anchored, to just sit with him a minute longer. And he looked at her, really looked at her, in a way he hadn't looked at a living soul since his wife died, and whispered a "thank you" that they both knew was for far more than fixing his leg. It was the first time in 7 years he had allowed someone to take care of him, and in a very real way, that was the exact moment Bernard Hayes came back to life. Bernard's leg took weeks to heal, and during that time, the roles in the cabin completely reversed. It was Eleanor who swung the axe, Eleanor who fed the livestock, Eleanor who hiked halfway down the trail to fetch medicinal herbs from Granny Ida, and Bernard, forced to sit still for the first time in his adult life, discovered the joy of conversation. Propped up by the fire with his leg elevated, he told Eleanor things he hadn't spoken aloud in decades. About his dirt-poor childhood, his severe father who only communicated through hard labor, the silly fear of the dark he had as a boy, the folk songs his mother used to sing. In return, Eleanor talked about the forbidden novels she snuck into her convent school, the romantic dreams she had locked away in a box, her lifelong love for the sound of rain on a tin roof. It was through those long, lazy weeks of recovery that they finally saw each other completely. They realized that despite coming from entirely different universes, they were carved from the exact same wood, a deep, ancient loneliness and a stubborn, defiant hope that life could still be beautiful. When Bernard was finally back on his feet, walking with a slight limp but solid ground beneath him, something happened that the mountain would talk about for years. He drove down into the village with Eleanor sitting right beside him on the wagon. It was a Saturday market day, the busiest time of the month in Windy Hollow. When the lumberjack's wagon rattled down the dirt road with a striking, well-dressed woman sitting on the bench, conversations across the square died one by one. Heads turned. Soon, the entire market was staring. This was the same Bernard Hayes who hadn't spoken more than 3 words to anyone in 7 years. The brooding giant who usually sold his wood with his head down and vanished back up the ridge before dusk. And here he was, beard trimmed, wearing a clean shirt Eleanor had mended, gently helping a lady step down from the wagon as if she were made of fine china. Eleanor felt the weight of all those staring eyes, and for a horrible second, the old panic seized her. What if someone recognizes me? What if word gets back to Richmond? But Bernard, sensing her hesitation, simply offered her his arm. It was a small, quiet gesture that told her without a single word that she wasn't alone anymore. Whatever came, they would face it together. She took a deep breath, lifted her chin, hooked her arm through the lumberjacks, and walked into the bustling market like she had every right to be there. Because she did. The village folks, suspicious by nature but not entirely made of stone, slowly melted. Old Otis's wife, a woman known for a razor-sharp tongue but a marshmallow heart, was the first to break the ice. She marched over and offered Eleanor a slice of sweet cornbread purely as an excuse to snoop. Eleanor, who was highly educated but possessed not an ounce of arrogance, thanked her with such genuine warmth and simplicity that, within half an hour, she was actively helping Otis's wife balance the ledger, politely catching a math error that was costing the poor egg vendor good money. The news that the mountain lady could read, write, and do sums spread through the market like wildfire. Before noon, a line had formed, folks asking her to read a letter from a drafted son, to check a shipping receipt, to pen a note to distant kin. Eleanor helped every single one of them with endless patience and a bright smile. And Bernard, leaning against his wagon, watched it all unfold with a quiet, swelling pride he hadn't known he was still capable of feeling. On the ride back, climbing the mountain bathed in the golden light of the late afternoon, they were quiet, but it was a rich, comfortable silence. Halfway up, Eleanor laughed softly and remarked that it was the first day in months she hadn't constantly looked over her shoulder. Bernard answered, with that rugged economy of words he used for saying the most important things, that she could stop looking over her shoulder for good. Because from now on, his shoulder was right there beside hers to block the view. Eleanor didn't say anything back. She just rested her head against his arm, and they rode the rest of the way up like that, the old mule navigating the familiar trail while the sky burned bright orange, then bruised purple. And the first evening stars peeked over the hemlocks, shining down like they were happy for the two of them. What neither of them realized was that their trip to the market carried both a price and a reward. The price was that, scattered among the good country folks, there was a pair of interested ears, a traveling salesman passing through, who took careful note of the refined, educated woman who clearly didn't belong in the rough high country. He filed that away, having heard whispers of a hefty bounty for a woman fitting that exact description. It was pulling this loose thread that would eventually lead Silas Montgomery right to their doorstep. But the reward was infinitely greater. That Saturday, the entire village, without even realizing it, adopted Eleanor as one of their own. And when the hour of danger finally struck, it would be those exact same simple folks, the ones she had helped with letters and ledgers and a kind smile, who would march up that mountain to form a wall around her. Because kindness in the mountains, just like everywhere else, is a seed. You plant it blind, and you only harvest it down the road, exactly when you need it most. There was one specific night during that sweet stretch of time after his leg healed that they would both cherish forever. It was another Saturday, under a full, blindingly bright moon that painted the mountain silver. The cold was still sharp, but it had a sweet crispness to it. Bernard had spent the whole afternoon secretly tinkering with something out in the woodshed, and Eleanor had pretended not to notice, even though she was dying of curiosity. After supper, acting incredibly awkward and wiping his hands on his trousers far more than necessary, he handed her a cloth-wrapped bundle. Inside was a small box made of red cedar, sanded until it was smooth as glass. The lid was deeply carved with the silhouette of a pine tree, and beneath it, two initials, a B and an E, carved side by side. He had made it himself with his own rough hands during the nights she thought he was just repairing axes. He muttered, unable to meet her eyes, that he had noticed she kept a few letters and crumpled keepsakes stuffed in her apron pocket. He figured she deserved a proper, beautiful place to store her things, seeing as the cabin was her home now, too. Eleanor opened the little cedar box. Inside, he had lined the bottom with a scrap of crimson velvet. She recognized it instantly, and her heart broke in the best way possible. It was the only piece of fine fabric in the house, cut from the one decent necktie he owned. She couldn't speak. She just clutched the box to her chest and let the tears spill over. For all her years as a wealthy merchant's daughter, showered with expensive gifts bought by a father who never actually looked at her, she had never received anything that meant a fraction as much as this little wooden box, carved by calloused hands in stolen hours of the night. Acting on a sudden impulse, she went to her trunk and pulled out the one treasure she had managed to grab during her midnight escape. It was wrapped in a silk handkerchief, a tiny silver wind-up music box that had belonged to her mother, who died when Eleanor was just a little girl. She wound the key. A delicate, crystalline melody began to play, filling the cabin with a refined sound those rough pine walls had never heard. And then, with tears still wet on her cheeks but a radiant smile on her face, Eleanor held out her hand and asked Bernard to dance. He backed away, mortified, stammering that he didn't know how, that he was a clumsy ox, that he'd crush her toes. She insisted, laughing, telling him it didn't matter, that nobody was watching, that it was just the two of them and the moon. And that giant of a man, who felled massive timber and hauled logs on his back, stood up shaking harder than a leaf in a gale. He placed one massive, awkward hand on her waist, and they began to sway, slowly, awkwardly, right in the middle of the kitchen, to the tinkling sound of the music box. Two battered souls whom life had only ever taught how to work and how to hurt, finally learning, late in the game, how to just dance for the joy of it, to dance for love. They danced until the music box wound down to a halt, When the music stopped, they didn't let go. They just stood there, wrapped in the quiet, their faces inches apart, their breath mingling in the cold air. And right there, bathed in the moonlight spilling through the window, Bernard finally raised one of his heavy hands and with infinite gentleness tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear. He leaned in, moving excruciatingly slow, giving her every chance to pull away. She didn't. They kissed for the very first time, a long, hesitant, breathtaking kiss, a kiss carrying the weight of his 7 years of crushing loneliness and her entire lifetime of feeling invisible. A kiss with absolutely no rush behind it, because, like every good thing that had grown between them, it had patiently waited for the exact right season to bloom. When they pulled apart, neither said a word. There was no need. The silent music box and the little cedar chest sitting on the table said everything that needed saying. Two lonely drifters had, at last, found a safe place to put their hearts. If you've made it this far, and you're already rooting for these two, go ahead and hit that like button and let me know in the comments. Do you believe love really can heal the deepest wounds? I really want to know what you think. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now, because this story isn't over, and I promise you the best part is still to come. But the mountain, no matter how high and isolated it feels, is never completely cut off from the rest of the world. And the world, the ruthless world Eleanor had run from, had not forgotten her. Silas Montgomery was not a man who accepted defeat. Losing a bride on the eve of his wedding, practically in front of the entire high society of Richmond, wasn't a heartbreak for him. It was a massive blow to his pride. And injuries to a man's pride, especially a man like Silas, hurt worse and heal slower than any other wound. He didn't love Eleanor. He had never loved her, but he considered her his property, an asset he had bought and paid for, that was stolen before delivery. He was hunting her down, not to win her back, but to retrieve her, the exact same way a rancher tracks down a prized heifer that jumped the fence. He dispatched men all across the state. He plastered money everywhere, promising a king's ransom for information. And since money always finds a willing ear, it was only a matter of time before the hunt reached the foothills. One afternoon, 2 men rode into Windy Hollow. They wore expensive city coats, rode purebred horses, and started asking aggressive questions about a dark-haired, well-spoken woman who might have passed through. They flashed a photograph and loudly mentioned the bounty. The village, instinctively distrustful of slick city folk, responded with that masterful, shoulder-shrugging silence that mountain communities have perfected over generations. Nobody had seen a thing. But gossip acts like a spark in dry brush, and beneath that wall of silence, the news shot from mouth to mouth until it finally reached the one person who had actually hiked up Bernard Hayes's trail in the last few months. That person was Granny Ida. Granny Ida was the mountain's midwife and healer. No one knew exactly how old she was. She was built as thin as a fence rail, wore a tight white braid pinned to the nape of her neck, and had piercing hawk-like eyes that always seemed to see a little more than you wanted them to. She lived in a crooked shack halfway up the trail between the village and Bernard's clearing, and she was one of the few souls on earth Bernard hadn't managed to scare off. She was the one who had brought Bernard into the world 40 years ago, and she was the one who had marched through the blizzard to tend to Teresa in her final days, purely out of stubborn grit when the town doctor refused. Bernard owed her a level of respect he didn't give anyone else alive, and Granny Ida, in return, treated the massive lumberjack like a lost, brooding son she fully expected to knock some sense into eventually. About 3 weeks prior, Granny Ida had huffed her way up to the clearing to drop off some fresh eggs and medicinal roots, and had, naturally, walked right into Eleanor. She didn't make a fuss at the time. She just measured the younger woman from head to toe with those sharp eyes, drank a cup of coffee, and muttered to Bernard on her way out that he looked slightly less like a walking corpse than usual. Then she hobbled off, cackling at her own joke. Up until this point, she was the only person in the world who knew a woman was living in the Lumberjack's cabin. So, when she overheard those two slick men down at the general store flashing money for a runaway bride, Granny Ida's ancient heart skipped a beat. She didn't say a word to anyone. She played the doddering old fool, finished selling her herbs, and the second she was out of sight, she hauled herself up that steep trail faster than her tired legs had any business moving. She arrived at the clearing completely winded, just as the sun was dipping below the ridge, and pulled Bernard aside. She spilled everything: the men, the photograph, the bounty, the questions. She told him she didn't know what kind of hell the girl had stirred up and she didn't care, but judging by the stark terror on Eleanor's face when she first mentioned the men, whatever was waiting for her down the mountain was evil. And then Granny Ida looked dead into Bernard's eyes and said something that would echo in his bones forever. She told him that life rarely gives a man a second chance to protect someone he failed to protect the first time around, and that if he was going to do something about it, he damn well better do it right this time. Eleanor, who had caught pieces of the conversation through the open door, went deathly pale. Her legs gave out, and she had to grip the doorframe to stay upright. Silas had found her. He had tracked her to the edge of the earth, and she knew instantly that she couldn't stay. Staying meant pulling the wrath of a ruthless baron down onto Bernard and Granny Ida, the only two people who had shown her true kindness. She wouldn't allow it. The second Granny Ida headed back down, Eleanor started frantically stuffing her few belongings into a sack, fully intending to vanish into the deeper mountains that very night alone. Taking the danger far away from the man she loved, Bernard caught her tying off the bundle, and for the first time since she arrived, he raised his voice, not in anger, but in a raw, gut-wrenching panic he didn't know he possessed. He demanded to know where the hell she thought she was going. Eleanor, her eyes spilling tears, choked out that she was leaving. She sobbed that she wasn't going to let Silas destroy him because of her, that she had already cost him too much, that she was just a desperate stray who had crashed into his life and had no right to ruin the peace he had built here. And that was when Bernard Hayes delivered the longest, truest speech he had spoken in 7 years. He told her that there was no peace in this cabin before she got there. He said that what he called peace was just a broken man waiting to rot away, and he hadn't realized how dead he was until she walked in and dragged the life back into him. He told her that once, a long time ago, he had left a woman he loved to face the dark all by herself, because he foolishly thought going for help was the right thing to do. That woman died alone because of his choice, and he had sworn to God over her grave that he would never, ever let someone he loved face the wolves alone again. And finally, swallowing hard, finding courage from some deep, buried well inside him, he looked right at her. He said he wasn't exactly sure how to say what he was feeling, but the mere thought of watching her walk down that trail and vanish into the night ripped him apart worse than anything he had felt in 7 years. He said that if it hurt that bad, it meant something real, and he was not letting her go. Eleanor dropped the bag. They stood there in the middle of the lantern-lit cabin, closer than they had ever been. For a second it felt like they were finally going to say out loud the words their eyes and their hands had been whispering for months. But they didn't. Not yet. Eleanor just stepped forward and buried her face against Bernard's broad chest. After a split second of hesitation, he wrapped his massive arms around her, holding her with a fierce, protective gentleness that completely defied his size. They stayed anchored together like that, while outside the night swallowed the mountain, and somewhere down in the valley, a man with a bruised ego was saddling his horses. That night, lying in their separate corners but kept wide awake by the exact same dread, they stared at the ceiling, trying to figure out a plan. Bernard, working the problem with his usual rugged practicality, knew running was useless. A man with Silas's wealth and spite would hunt them to the ends of the earth. Eleanor would spend her whole life looking over her shoulder, jumping from ridge to ridge, never having a place to call home. Hiding was also useless. The hounds were already at the door. The only way out, Bernard realized, was straight through. Not with fists and not with guns, because that would just give Silas the legal excuse he needed to slaughter them and burn the mountain down. They had to fight him with the truth, in the daylight, in front of witnesses, where the power of a corrupt timber baron suddenly shrinks when he's forced to do his dirty work out in the open. The next morning over coffee, Bernard laid it out. He told Eleanor she was a free woman. She hadn't married Silas. She hadn't signed any legal binding papers. The law, as twisted as it might be for a woman in 1919, couldn't force her into marriage at gunpoint. Silas didn't have the law on his side. He only had fear. The fear he weaponized to make people look the other way. But fear, Bernard said, only works in the shadows. In the broad daylight, standing in front of the preacher, the sheriff, and the whole damn village, a man can't just throw a screaming woman over a horse and ride off without becoming a kidnapper in the eyes of everyone watching. His plan wasn't to hide. It was to go down. To march right into Windy Hollow, in front of God and everyone, and make it crystal clear that Eleanor was there by her own free will, under his protection and the protection of the town. And anyone who wanted to take her would have to go through the law, and all of them to do it. Eleanor was terrified, a bone-deep, paralyzing fear, but she understood. She saw the logic in Bernard's plan, and more than that, she saw that this man was willing to risk his own life, shatter his 7 years of absolute isolation, and step into the crosshairs of a millionaire, all just to stand by her side. If there had been a single lingering doubt in her heart about what she felt for this lumberjack, it vaporized right then, melted by the heat of his quiet, unshakable courage. That final night before the confrontation felt like it lasted a year. They both knew Silas wouldn't wait much longer. Every ticking minute brought him closer, and fear hung in the cabin like a thick fog. Eleanor tried to busy herself, scrubbing pots that were already clean, folding rags, but her hands shook violently. Eventually, a tin mug slipped from her grasp, clattered to the floor, and she just broke down, dropping to her knees and sobbing over the spilled coffee. Not about the mug, but about everything, the crushing weight of it all. Bernard dropped his tools, crossed the room, dropped heavily onto his bad knee beside her, and pulled her into a tight embrace without saying a word. She had taught him that sometimes a silent hug speaks infinitely louder than a speech. When the panic finally subsided, they stayed right there, sitting on the pine floorboards, leaning against the wall, holding hands and talking in low voices deep into the night. Eleanor confessed her absolute darkest fear. She wasn't afraid of being dragged back. She was terrified that Bernard would be killed defending her. She whispered that she couldn't survive carrying that guilt, that he had already endured a lifetime of suffering and didn't deserve to bleed for a stray woman who brought nothing but trouble to his door. Bernard squeezed her hand, and then he told her something she would carry with her until her dying day. He said that for 7 years he had lived in absolute terror of loving someone again, purely to avoid the agony of losing them. And he had realized, far too late, that living in fear of losing is just a slower way of dying every single day without throwing a punch. He told her he would rather face down 10 timber barons than go back to the empty, hollow ghost of a life he had before she knocked on his door. And he said that if there was one undeniable truth he learned from burying Teresa, it was this: you don't get to choose how much time you have with the person you love, but you absolutely get to choose whether you live that time to the fullest or squander it cowering in the dark. He had chosen to live, Eleanor rested her forehead against his shoulder. For the first time since the night she fled Richmond, a bizarre, overwhelming sense of peace washed over her right in the middle of the storm. It was the peace of someone who, finally, is no longer facing the hurricane alone. They stayed awake for hours, and eventually the sheer absurdity of the tension broke, and they even started laughing softly. They joked about the day she nearly chopped off her own toe with a hatchet, and the priceless, scandalous look on Granny Ida's face when she realized they were falling for each other. Because that's how you actually beat fear. Not by pretending the monster isn't at the door, but by holding someone's hand in the dark and finding a reason to smile anyway. They fell asleep right there on the floor, leaning against each other. And that was how the dawn found them, armed only with their courage and each other, ready for whatever hell was coming up the mountain. As it turned out, they didn't have to go down to the village, because Silas came up. It happened the next day, right at high noon. The sound hit them first, the heavy thud of hooves on the dirt trail, the snorting of laboring beasts, the jingle of expensive silver riding tack. Bernard was splitting logs in the clearing when they broke through the tree line, 3 men on horseback. Taking the lead on a massive, glossy black stallion was Silas Montgomery himself. He was a man of average height, but carried a suffocating weight of authority. Dressed impeccably in a tailored black coat, his silver-streaked moustache perfectly trimmed, he had pale, dead eyes that never seemed to blink. Behind him rode his 2 hired thugs, hard-faced men with heavy revolvers holstered prominently on their hips. Bernard didn't drop his axe. He casually adjusted his grip, not aggressively, but making it clear he wasn't unarmed, and planted himself dead in the center of the clearing, standing squarely between the invaders and the cabin door where Eleanor was. Silas halted his stallion a few yards away. He looked down at the massive, bearded lumberjack with a calm, practiced disdain, the specific kind of arrogance of a man who has spent his entire life buying or crushing every obstacle in his path. In a chillingly polite tone, which was infinitely more threatening than a scream, he asked if this was the property of Mr. Bernard Hayes. Bernard nodded once. Silas then announced that he had come to collect stolen property, a runaway bride. And he knew on very good authority she was hiding inside. He spat the word bride with a venomous sense of ownership that made Bernard's stomach twist. Silas added, casually adjusting his leather riding gloves as if preparing to dismount, that he didn't want any trouble with a hard-working local. He said if Bernard simply handed the girl over, they would ride away, and everyone could go back to their peaceful, pathetic little lives. Bernard didn't flinch. He didn't take a step back. His voice was as steady and solid as the hickory handle in his fist. He told the Baron that nobody's bride was on this mountain. He said there was a free woman inside, a woman who had walked up here on her own 2 feet and who would stay exactly as long as she damn well pleased. And he added, locking eyes with the millionaire, that as far as he knew, this was America in 1919. Slavery was over. Women weren't cattle to be roped, branded, and dragged back to the barn just because some rich man thought he bought the deed. Silas's face darkened. The calm disdain evaporated, replaced by a cold, murderous fury. He gave a subtle nod. The 2 thugs behind him rested their hands on their revolvers, not drawing them yet, but unsnapping the leather holsters so Bernard could see. Silas leaned forward in the saddle and hissed through clenched teeth. He told the lumberjack he had absolutely no idea who he was dealing with. He said he could buy this entire mountain and every miserable hillbilly squatting on it with pocket change. He promised Bernard that with one single word, his worthless life would end right here in the dirt, and not a soul on earth would ever notice he was gone. And that was when the cabin door swung open. Eleanor stepped out. Bernard threw her a desperate look, silently begging her to go back inside, but she was already marching forward. Her chin was raised high. She was pale as a ghost, but her steps were steady. She walked right past Bernard and stood shoulder to shoulder with him in the dirt, staring directly into the face of the monster she had spent months running from. Her voice shook on the first syllable, but with every word she spoke, it gathered the strength of a thunderstorm. She told Silas no one needed to die today, because there was absolutely nothing here he could take by force. She told him she wasn't his bride, she had never married him, she had never signed a single piece of paper, and she never would. She said she was sorry his pride was bruised, but a bruised ego didn't give any man the right to own another human being. And looking straight into those dead, cold eyes, she delivered the final blow. She told him he might have all the money in the world, but there was one thing he had never possessed, and would never possess: her will. Silas let out a dry, humorless bark of a laugh. He sneered that her will wasn't worth the mud on his boots. He said her father had shaken his hand, deals had been struck, land had been transferred, big money affairs that a spoiled, dramatic little girl couldn't possibly comprehend. He didn't even look at her as he flicked his wrist, signaling his armed men to dismount and grab her. Bernard tightened his grip on the axe and took a massive step forward, dropping into a fighting stance. He was fully prepared to hack his way through to the bitter end, to defend her, even though he knew exactly how a fight of an axe against 3 guns was going to end. But the thugs never dismounted, because at that exact second, movement stirred in the shadows of the tree line. Silhouettes began stepping out from behind the massive pines, encircling the clearing. First came Granny Ida, leaning on her gnarled walking stick, her hawk eyes burning with defiance. Then came old Otis, the general store owner, cradling a double-barreled hunting shotgun casually across his forearm, not aiming it, just holding it. Then the village blacksmith carrying a heavy iron hammer, the teamster, 2 or 3 weather-beaten women, a dozen rugged mountain men, simple folks in patched overalls and faded dresses, faces tanned like leather by the sun. They poured out of the woods in absolute terrifying silence, forming a wide, unbreakable human ring around the clearing. Granny Ida, who knew the mountain shortcuts better than the deer, had spent the entire night and morning knocking on every single door in Windy Hollow, spreading the word. And the mountain community, the very same people who used to treat Bernard like a scary, isolated lunatic, responded the way mountain folks always do when one of their own is threatened. They showed up. Silas slowly looked around. The math had drastically changed. It was no longer 3 armed men against 1 stubborn lumberjack. It was 3 slick city boys surrounded by an entire mountain of heavily armed, furious locals. These people knew every rock, every ravine, and every hiding spot in this hollow. And right now, they were staring at Silas with a dead, icy quiet that was infinitely more terrifying than a mob screaming for blood. One of the thugs, clearly the smarter of the 2, slowly moved his hand away from his gun and leaned over to whisper urgently into his boss's ear. The reality was brutally simple. They might win the initial shootout, but they would never make it to the bottom of the mountain, alive to spend their paychecks. Granny Ida took 1 step forward into the clearing. She spoke up, her voice sharp and raspy, the voice of a woman who has seen babies born and men die and isn't afraid of a damn thing. She looked right up at the millionaire on the black horse and told him he had 2 choices. Option 1, he could press the issue and the mountain would make sure he was remembered forever, just not in a way he was going to like. Option 2, he could turn those pretty horses around, ride his fancy suit back down to the easy life he came from, buy himself a bride who actually wanted him, and leave this girl alone to live the life she chose. She cracked a toothless, wicked smile and added the final nail to the coffin. She told him a real man doesn't need to drag a woman to the altar by her hair. And if he had to do that, then all his big money and fancy barren posturing wasn't worth a bucket of spit. It was a direct hit to the only place Silas felt pain, his ego. Humiliated, outgunned and cornered, but desperately trying not to give the crowd the satisfaction of seeing him lose his temper, Silas viciously yanked the reins of his stallion. His face was mottled red with rage. He spat a final pathetic threat that this wasn't over, that he had high-priced lawyers, that he had powerful friends, that he was going to ruin the life of this miserable dirt-farming lumberjack. But they were empty words, and every single soul standing in that clearing knew it. A man who has to scream about what he's going to do is a man who has already lost. He whipped his horse around and spurred it hard down the trail. His thugs scrambled to follow him. The thundering of hooves echoed down the ridge until it faded completely, leaving nothing behind but the sound of the wind in the hemlocks and the chirp of the birds. And Silas was right about one thing. It didn't end there, but it didn't end the way he promised. His threat backfired spectacularly. The story of the ruthless millionaire timber baron who rode into the mountains with hired guns to kidnap a runaway bride, only to be chased off by a bunch of hillbillies with pitchforks spread through Richmond like a wildfire. His wounded pride turned into public humiliation. The high society families who used to grovel at his feet suddenly started avoiding him at the club. Eleanor's father, deeply shamed by the scandal and perhaps finally struck by a delayed pang of conscience, sent a letter up through Granny Ida. He formally broke the engagement and told Eleanor that if she ever wanted to come home, his door was open. Eleanor read the letter, folded it neatly, and wrote a reply. There was no anger in it, only absolute certainty. She thanked him but told him she had already found her home, and her home was right here, high on the mountain, among the pines. On the night Silas rode down the mountain to never return, after the village folks had dispersed and the clearing belonged to just the two of them again, Bernard and Eleanor sat side by side on the porch. They watched the heavy fog roll up from the valley, exactly like Bernard and Teresa used to do, in what felt like another lifetime. They sat in silence for a long time, but it wasn't the awkward silence of strangers anymore. It was the profound, shared silence of two people who had weathered a brutal winter and survived a storm that was made of much more than just ice. And it was there, with no grand plan and no rehearsed speeches, that they finally said out loud what their hearts had been screaming for months. Eleanor spoke first. She looked out at the rolling fog and whispered that she had never felt more at home in her entire life than she did in this little shack at the edge of the world. She said she had run away from a mansion full of luxury and everything a woman was supposed to want, only to find, in a freezing lumberjack's cabin, the one thing she had always desperately craved but never knew how to name, a place where she could just be entirely herself. A place beside a man who looked at her and saw exactly who she was, not the property they wanted her to be. Bernard listened. When it was his turn to speak, the giant lumberjack who could fell a pine tree in 3 swings suddenly stuttered. He lost his words. He fidgeted, entirely unsure of what to do with his hands, so he gave up on fancy words. They had never been his strong suit anyway, and simply reached out and took her hand. He wrapped his massive calloused fingers around her delicate ones with an infinite heartbreaking tenderness. He only said one sentence, but it was the truest thing he had ever spoken. He told her he had spent 7 years believing his life had ended on a freezing winter night, and when she knocked on his door on another freezing winter night, she brought him back from the dead. He looked her in the eyes and told her that if she'd have him, he wanted to spend every single winter he had left, making absolutely sure she never, ever had to face the dark alone again. Eleanor cried. But it was a completely different kind of crying than she had ever done before. It wasn't tears of terror or grief or running away. It was the overwhelming relief of finally arriving. She rested her cheek against his broad shoulder, the shoulder that had carried so much crushing weight in total silence, and Bernard wrapped his heavy arm around her. They sat like that under the freezing, star-swept mountain sky. Two shattered hearts that life had broken into pieces, who by finding each other had finally learned how to beat whole again. If you've stuck with me this far and your heart is feeling a little warmer, do this old storyteller a favor. Hit that like button, drop the name of someone you love in the comments, and share this video with someone who needs a reminder that it is never, ever too late to start over. Because Bernard and Eleanor's story has one final chapter, and I promise you, you don't want to miss the most beautiful part. Time, that old faithful companion that heals everything if you just let it, swept over the mountain the way it always does, unhurried and unstoppable. Winters came and went. Each one felt milder than the first. Or maybe they were just easier to survive because they were no longer facing the cold alone. Bernard and Eleanor were married the following spring. It was a simple, rowdy ceremony at the little white church in Windy Hollow. Granny Ida was the maid of honor, weeping openly and aggressively, grumbling that she just had sawdust in her eye. The entire mountain turned out. The exact same people who had formed that protective ring in the clearing were now packed into the pews to celebrate. Old Otis shot off firecrackers, the blacksmith played a wheezing accordion, and Bernard Hayes, the brooding hermit the town swore had gone mad with grief, he danced. He was clumsy, his face was beet red, and he was laughing his head off. But he danced. Folks who saw him that day swore they could hardly recognize the joyful groom as the same grim shadow who used to sell firewood without ever looking a man in the eye. The early years of their marriage were an everyday discovery of the simple, profound joy of belonging to someone. Bernard, who for 7 years had woken up to a crushing silence, now woke to the smell of fresh coffee and the sound of Eleanor humming in the kitchen. Sometimes he would just lie there for a few extra seconds, terrified he was going to wake up and find it was all a dream. Eleanor, who had spent her entire life treated like a fragile, expensive ornament, discovered the deep satisfaction of being useful. She loved having calloused hands from her own hard work, loved looking around a home that was built by what the two of them accomplished together. They bickered sometimes, like any married couple, silly arguments over who left the chicken coop unlatched, or Bernard's infuriating stubbornness about climbing on the roof before his bad leg was fully healed. But the arguments always ended the exact same way, with one of them cracking a smile. Because neither of them, having waited their entire lives to find the other, could ever stomach staying mad for very long. The next winter hit hard, almost as brutal as the blizzard that brought Eleanor to the door. And it was during that brutal freeze that the mountain truly saw how profoundly Bernard Hayes had changed. Because when the fever returned to the hollows, the exact same cruel sickness that had stolen Teresa 7 years prior, the man who had once locked himself away in his own grief did the exact opposite of hiding. He marched down the mountain. He and Eleanor went from cabin to cabin. They hauled firewood to folks who were freezing. They brewed the medicinal roots Granny Ida prescribed. They helped carry the sick. They sat up through the night beside the beds of dying strangers. The lumberjack, who hadn't known how to save his own wife, threw himself body and soul into saving the children and parents of his neighbors. It was as if, with every soul he dragged back from the brink of death, he was finally making peace with that awful night in 1912. And the village, which had always treated him like the crazy loner on the hill, began to treat him like what he had truly become, a fundamentally good man. Watching him work through those grueling nights, Eleanor realized something about her husband that made her love him even deeper. She realized his overwhelming kindness didn't exist despite the tragedy he had suffered. It existed because of it. Only a man who intimately knows the bitter, suffocating agony of losing someone in the dark will run blindly into the night to hold a stranger's hand so they don't have to suffer it alone. Bernard's pain, which had been a suffocating prison for 7 years, had finally alchemized into something else entirely: pure, raw compassion. And there is no greater miracle life can pull off than taking a person's deepest trauma and forging it into a shield to protect others. As the years rolled on, the cabin in the high clearing transformed into a sanctuary for the entire mountain. If someone had a problem, they hiked up the trail. If someone needed advice, a legal document read, a ledger balanced, or just a massive pair of hands to help raise a barn beam, they knew there was always hot coffee on the stove and 2 people ready to help at the top of the ridge. That steep, treacherous trail that folks used to whisper about in fear became the most well-worn path in the county. By some beautiful poetic irony, the house a broken man built to hide from the world became the one door the entire mountain knocked on, absolutely certain it would always be opened. The cabin grew. Bernard, who was a master with timber, kept adding rooms as their life expanded. A proper bedroom, a wider kitchen, a sweeping wraparound porch where they could sit together in the evenings. Eleanor planted vibrant flower beds where there used to be nothing but stacked firewood. She hung curtains in the windows. She taught her rugged husband to appreciate the little comforts he never knew a home could have. The lonely clearing that was once a graveyard for a man running from life became the exact opposite. A bustling hub of life, filled with neighbors visiting, coffee poured around the table, and laughter ringing off the porch. As long as she lived, Granny Ida hiked up that trail every single week, claimed the best rocking chair, bossed the 2 of them around like they were toddlers, and was blissfully happy doing it. Eleanor quickly realized her fancy education wasn't useless up here after all. All those years in the convent school became a weapon for good. She became the unofficial clerk of the mountain. She read letters for illiterate mothers, balanced the books for the general store, and aggressively reviewed contracts that slick city buyers tried to force on the local farmers. She became the mountain's fiercely respected advisor. And Bernard, standing right beside her, fully rejoined the world of the living. He went down to the village to chat, to help patch a neighbor's roof, to swap jokes on the porch of old Otis's store. The legend of the terrifying, brooding hermit of the mountain became just that, an old ghost story the elders told the kids, a story the youngsters had a hard time believing when they looked at the smiling, gentle giant Bernard had become. He never stopped visiting the wooden cross beneath the white pine. Every Sunday morning, he still stood there with his hat in his hands. But the meaning of the visit changed. It was no longer a grim penance, a man whipping himself over an ancient failure. It was just a quiet, loving conversation with a cherished memory. A way of saying thank you, and Eleanor, far from being jealous, completely understood. Sometimes she walked out there with him. The 2 women in Bernard's life, the one resting in the earth and the one holding his hand, shared that space in perfect peace. Because true love is never something you divide or run out of. It's something that multiplies. In fact, it was Eleanor who planted a white rose bush at the base of the cross. Every spring, brilliant white roses bloomed over Teresa's grave, as if the mountain itself was promising that no one there had been forgotten. Then there was Eleanor's dream, the project that was arguably the most beautiful legacy she left on that ridge. Tired of seeing good, hard-working folks swindled because they couldn't read the fine print, and heartbroken by kids growing up without ever touching a book, she convinced Bernard to build an addition. He framed up a large, sturdy wooden lean-to right next to the cabin, filled it with long benches, and hung a slate chalkboard on the wall. 3 afternoons a week, Eleanor ran a free schoolhouse. She taught the alphabet and arithmetic to anyone who wanted to learn, whether they were barefoot kids or grizzled old loggers. At first, only a few showed up, highly suspicious of book learning. But soon they came in droves. Whole families hiked up the trail together, and the clearing that had once only echoed with the violent thud of an axe began to ring with the most beautiful sound a mountain can make. The sound of people learning to spell, sounding out words, discovering the vast, incredible world that unlocks when you learn to read. Bernard built the desks, patched the roof, and often just stood in the doorway listening, a man with barely a grade school education himself, his chest swelling with fierce pride, watching his wife light up so many minds. Granny Ida lived a long time, fueled by pure, stubborn spite, and she stuck around long enough to see all of this flourish. She loved to boast, with her trademark abrasive affection, that she was the one who practically forced them together. She reminded everyone constantly that if she hadn't run up that mountain to warn them, the Baron would have snatched the girl, and therefore this entire happily ever after was 100% her doing. And nobody argued with her because deep down they knew she was right. When she finally passed away, an incredibly old woman dying peacefully in her sleep, the entire mountain mourned. Bernard and Eleanor buried her in their clearing, right near Teresa's white pine. They said, correctly, that family isn't just the blood you inherit, but the people who carry the weight of love with you. The following spring, right next to the white roses, Eleanor planted a massive patch of sunflowers. Because she always said that, despite her razor-sharp tongue, Granny Ida was the closest thing to sunshine that cold mountain had ever known. Many years passed, countless winters, countless springs. If you were to hike up that once-feared trail today, you would find a weathered wooden cabin surrounded by blooming flowers with a wide porch overlooking the Appalachian Valley. And if you caught a lucky break on a crisp autumn afternoon, you might find two old folks sitting there, holding hands, watching the fog roll in. He is still a giant of a man, though his shoulders are bowed by time and his beard is snow white, but he has the exact same brown eyes that once hid so much sorrow and now hold nothing but absolute peace. She has her silver hair pinned up in a loose bun, her face lined with deep wrinkles that were almost entirely carved by decades of smiling. Two old souls who walked the long road of life side by side, and who still, after all these years, occasionally catch each other's eye with that same timid wonder of their first winter together, as if they still can't quite believe their incredible luck in finding one another. And if you ask them what the secret was, what miraculous magic transformed two crushing, isolated tragedies into such a magnificent love story, neither of them could probably give you a straight answer. Eleanor might laugh and blame it on the freezing rain. Bernard, always a man of few words, would probably just point a weathered finger at the heavy wooden front door, the very door he almost didn't open on a freezing night, and leave it at that. Because that was the truth. The entire miracle hinged on one incredibly simple gesture, the choice of a terrified man who, despite having every reason in the world to keep his walls up, chose to unlock the door, and the choice of a shattered woman who, despite having lost everything, found the courage to knock, because when you get right down to it, that's what life is all about. Doors. Some we slam shut, convinced we're protecting ourselves, when really we're just locking ourselves in a cage. And others we pull open, our hands shaking with fear, having no idea that standing on the other side is the exact miracle we desperately needed, but didn't dare believe we could still have. Bernard Hayes opened his door on a frosty night, fully expecting to look death in the eye. Instead, he found, shivering in the cold, the beginning of everything that would make his life worth living again. I hope this story reminds you, sitting there on the other side of the screen, of one very simple, beautiful truth. It doesn't matter how many brutal winters you've had to survive alone. It doesn't matter how permanently locked you think your door is. As long as you have breath in your lungs, there is always the chance for an unexpected knock, a second chance, a love that shows up when you have absolutely given up hope and changes the entire rest of the journey. Sometimes the only thing happiness demands of us is the courage to turn the knob. If this story touched your heart, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments, do you believe it's never too late to start over? Share your own story down there. I read every single one of them. And stick around, because next week I'll have another one of these old-time tales to warm your soul. Until then, take care of the people you love, and never ever be afraid to open the door.